Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me up here. I'm very sorry to hear talk takes place in such inauspicious circumstances, but I'm still delighted for the generosity of the donor for making it possible for me to come here today. The title of the talk, Popular Sovereignty and Religious Peoples in the Arab World, I've tried to essentially refer to two different kinds of principles that would seem to be operating almost completely in complete contradiction to each other. One is the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that a people should be self-governing and should make the ultimate rules about political life. And the second, a religious belief, in a sense, one that in an Islamic context is often connected with an argument for divine sovereignty, that we are, the belief that we're supposed to live our lives in accordance with God's instructions, and that therefore sovereignty properly lies with God. When you put it that way, the two ideas sound almost in complete contradiction to each other. Well, better minds than mine have tried to combine them on a theoretical level. I'm not going to be talking so much on a theoretical level today. I'm going to be talking really on a practical level. I'm going to argue that, in fact, the problem in the Arab world is not how to combine the principles in theory, but an awful lot of the problems come up in various practical attempts to try and meet both standards at the same time. The problem, as I've stated it, would seem to be utterly foreign to an American audience, right? We live in a society that in the, you said I bring expertise from the most exotic location, Washington, D.C. I actually live outside the Beltway in the state of Virginia. I live outside the Beltway by about half a mile. But I still will talk now as a Virginian, I guess. I'm not originally from there, but I live there now, and quote the famous phrase of a Virginian over 200 years ago, that we live in a country in which we accept the principle of a wall of separation between religion and state. And so the idea of trying to incorporate an element of popular sovereignty would, of divine sovereignty within a democratic system would seem to be utterly foreign and alien. I'm not quite so sure that's true today if I look at the politics in the state of Virginia, where it happens all the time that people make political arguments and try to play a religious card. And I'm not even sure if it really worked that well or completely if you look back to the founding documents. So I'm going to actually start very briefly in an American context and use that as a way to go into an American context. And I'll explain why I'm using that kind of odd entry in a moment. Our fundamental Declaration of Sovereignty, the Declaration of Independence, famously proceeds almost in the manner of a Euclidean proof from fundamentals and incontrovertibly self-evident postulates, among them that all men are created and endowed by their creator with a capital C, with certain inalienable rights. So we live in a country in which divine, you could say that the basic Declaration of Sovereignty is rooted in some kind of divine. Now, you'll object right away, or you should object right away, that in the 18th century they used capital letters with greater abandon than we do today. In our current sort of E.E. Cummings historical state, we don't think in terms of ultimate creators. We don't think in terms of divine origins. It makes as much sense, to regard, if you buy a cup of coffee with a $5 bill. Well, it's not quite $5, but we'll say with a couple $1 bills, and they say "In God We Trust," viewing that as a religious act. What these words have to do is they tell us perhaps something about our history, but in order to understand these religious ideas these principles, you really have to understand how they've lived and evolved historically, and that's exactly my point for the Arab world. That. What I want to do today is to ground our understanding of these big ideas of divine sovereignty, of popular sovereignty, in the lived experiences of real peoples in the Arab world. The way that I'm going to do that is to essentially proceed a little bit historically over the last couple centuries, in three stages of I think the struggle to sort of figure out how to combine those two ideas. The first is exploring the relationship between Islamic law and the rule of law, leaving sort of democracy and popular sovereignty aside for a moment, but just trying to understand ways in which the Islamic legal tradition could have lent itself to a tradition of the rule of law, or whether it did. That's the first task. Then the second task, I will introduce in the 20th century the principle of the rule of the people. Some kind of popular sovereignty, which really wasn't accepted in Arab political doctrine until the 20th century. And then in the final stage, in the third part of my talk, I'm going to focus on really the 21st century, when the idea of popular sovereignty is increasingly expected to have institutional expression in democratic forms, where popular sovereignty is no longer supposed to be simply a slogan. So let me first start with that first task, which really is sort of pre-20th century, the relationship between Islamic law and the rule of law. Can they somehow be combined? When you look at it, it would seem to be anybody familiar with the Islamic with tradition of Islamic thought in any number of realms would see some very easy places where you could derive some kind of conception of the rule of law, simply because it's the community of Muslim scholars have always expressed themselves as much or as fully in legal questions and legal debates as in anything else. Islamic law, in some ways, it can be kind of the centerpiece of an Islamic intellectual tradition. So that would seem to make the Islamic, Islam as a religion is understood by Muslims, one that is very friendly to the idea of the rule of law, the idea that there's some kind of supreme being who is a source of law, that encourages the idea that earthly political authorities have to be held accountable to some kind of higher standards. And actually, if you look at other writings on constitutionalism and the idea of the rule of law, they often root them in traditions of natural law, of Christianity and Judaism, and Islam with its very strong legal orientation would seem to lend itself just as easily, in some ways perhaps more so, than some other religious traditions. So the problem with trying to develop some kind of Islamic conception of constitutionalism or the rule of law, I don't think it's in the theoretical realm. It's very much in the practical realm. The reason that Islamic, I think, legal thought didn't really develop fully in a constitutionalist manner had less to do with ideas and more in the sorts of institutions and practices that were established in order to pursue, understand Islamic law. It was set up, Islamic law was understood, pursued, studied, reproduced, in a sense, in a set of institutions that were largely distinct from the institutions of governing. It was in the realm of legal scholarship, education, courts, and so on. Those kinds of arrangements were ones which political authorities would often show some deference to, and that they, in turn, would show some deference to political authorities, but it was not necessarily constitutionalist. Now, I don't want to speak too sweepingly here of all of Islamic history. There was all kinds of historical variation. In the period immediately before the modern era, and I'm counting the modern era essentially as the 19th and 20th century, when most of the Arab world was governed by the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire itself had regularized and bureaucratized a set of religious institutions, legal institutions, and educational establishment, and so on, that was much more melded into the political structures, governing political structures, that I think may have existed in some other places. So the idea of somehow melding political authority and Islamic legal authority was something, in a sense, that the Ottomans had done to some extent. But what happened in the beginning of the 19th century was, I think, something much more extensive than even the Ottomans had contemplated. In the 19th century, in a few places, and then certainly in the 20th century, in most places in the Arab world, what happened was that states began to infringe on those institutions of Islamic learning, legal scholarship, education, courts, and not then just infringe upon them, but swallow them wholesale. That is, envelop them within the authoritative apparatus of the states. They basically forgot that spirit of deference and saying, Islamic scholars are part of a set of institutions that are somewhat separate from governing, and basically nationalize them. So And you could see that in all kinds of realms. Education being primarily the role of the state, religious institutions having been nationalized, religious endowments or endowments for religious institutions having been nationalized, and so forth and so on. I'll talk about this more in some specific institutional ways in a moment. But what happened as a result, I think, was that the old spirit of kind of mutual deference between religious authorities and political authorities began to break down, and it did so in a manner, or without the Islamic religious authorities having developed any real, I think, extensive sense of how to pursue and use Islamic law in a way that would hold rulers accountable in a modern bureaucratic state. So we come then to the second period of that I want to focus on, in which popular sovereignty was introduced. In essence, what happened was that as these bureaucratic states were built, they began to accept the idea, or even be predicated on the idea, that they were an expression of the will of a sovereign people. If you look, for instance, at the first constitutional documents that were issued governing the Arab world, many of them were issued in the name of the ruler. In the late 19th century. In the 20th century, they became to be issued in the name of the people. And when the people were brought into government, or brought into, I should say, issues of the creation of the state, it's not all that surprising that they brought their religion with them. And so you have the beginning of an attempt to define political community in terms of both popular sovereignty and religious sovereignty at the same time. It was one in which was, I don't think, a formal democratic process, or sometimes there were formal democratic mechanisms, but they certainly were not pluralist in nature. Instead, I would describe this period as broadly populist in its approach to Islam. When states began to speak in the name of the people, or to be claiming to speak for a sovereign people, they were very conscious that the majority of the people that they were speaking for were Muslim, and therefore stepped in to try and give that some sort of expression. They did so in ways that look, in comparative terms, a little bit odd. For the most part, what they were often interested in doing in the early period was protecting Islam. That is, Islam was a religion that needed state protection. It needed state protection from what? It needed state protection from missionaries. It needed state protection from extraterritoriality, the fact that citizens of other of European states often brought their legal status with them when they lived in many countries in the Arab world because of a set of agreements that dated back some time. And to some extent, religion needed protection from, I would say, kind of external cultural influences. So you see a set of rhetorical commitments in these documents of religious freedom, but religious freedom essentially meaning the state is protecting the rights of Muslims to pursue their religion, to pass it on to their children in sort of a communal sense. There were religious freedoms as well guaranteed to non-Muslim communities, as long as they were part of a recognized community and as long as they didn't try to spread their religion. Religious freedom on a communal basis. That is to say, it's much more generally a freedom to practice religion, a recognized religion, rather than an individual freedom of conscience that's recognized in constitutional documents. As time went on, the populism of this period, I think, had a specific and a strange kind of effect that I've called in a different context Islamic inflation. And what I mean by Islamic inflation is this: that what happened was that as states increasingly claimed to speak in the name of the people, they wanted to show their Islamic credentials. And they therefore, the earliest constitutional documents in the Arab world tended to talk about Islam being the religion of state, as giving the protections for Islam that I talked about. But as one state introduced a stronger clause, Another state felt that it had to match it and maybe even exceed it, or sometimes a state had to be a constitution written in one period when a certain provision, for instance, making the requiring that the president or the head of state be a Muslim, once you put something like that in, it's hard to take it out. And this process was steadily ratcheting up the rhetorical commitments to Islam. The commitments, for the most part, were purely rhetorical in nature. They didn't really change the structure of the state. They didn't really change anything in the political realm. In a sense, what they were, as I said, trying to sort of attempts to speak in the people's name and garner popular support without making any real institutional commitments. And this is most famously seen in the evolution of the what is still Article 2 in Egypt's constitution. Article 2 in Egypt's constitution reads today, the principles of the Islamic Sharia are the major source of legislation. The origins of that clause go back to Syria in 1950, when, I'm not quite sure, but it was the first time that an Arab constitution really, sort of as part of this populist spirit, decided that it had to have a lengthy ideological section. So they put in all kinds of ideological provisions, and if you're going to put in everything, how can you forget God? So they put in this Islamic provision, which nobody really thought that much about. A decade later, Kuwait's writing a constitution, and they think, well, we're a Muslim society. We're certainly better than the Syrians, and so they have to put in the same clause. 1971, Egypt's writing a new constitution. It's trying to turn us back a little bit on socialism. They put this clause in. Then in, but the clause is actually worded slightly differently. It's the principles of the Islamic Sharia shall be, or are a means of source of legislation. In 1980, there's a problem for the Egyptian regime, and that is that the president of Egypt has a limit of 2 terms in office, and those terms are about to expire. Now, it was very clear to all Egyptians that they required their president to remain in office longer, so they had to amend their constitution in order to meet the popular demand for another term for President Sadat. In order to ensure that the people would give the right answer to the question of removing term limitations on the president, what the constitutional amendment drafters decided to do was to present Egyptians with a whole range of constitutional amendments, one of which inserted the definite article the. So instead of the principles of the Islamic Sharia are a main source of legislation, the principles of the Islamic Sharia are the main source of legislation. And so Egyptians were presented the entire set of constitutional amendments as a package, and you were allowed to vote one of 2 ways. You could vote against the president and against Islam, or you could vote for the president and for Islam. And unsurprisingly, the president of Islam won in a landslide, over 99% of the vote, suggesting that Egypt's Christian population, about 10% of the country, was just as overjoyed to be ruled in accordance with the principles of Islamic law as the Muslim population. With this tremendous expression of popular will, the change was made in Egypt's constitution. That was the flavor of the commitment, the flavor of the way in which popular sovereignty was expressed in some kind of symbolic religious form. Again, however, if you look at institutional changes on the ground, you almost see things going in the opposite direction. Instead of the state deciding to operate completely on a religious basis, what it essentially does during this period is to move into the religious realm extremely aggressively. Let me just give you some examples. Education, the educational system, education in almost all states of the Arab, actually in all states of the Arab world, is compulsory. I mean, religious education is compulsory. Now, what that means is that if you want to go to a religious school, or if you want to go to a public school, you are going to be studying religion. Non-Muslims, of course, can usually opt out, and if there's a significant non-Muslim community, then they will often have their own separate instruction, sometimes even their own separate schools. But what that means is that if you pick up a set of school textbooks, just as there is an approved history, just as there is approved mathematics, just as there is an approved geography, there is an approved Islam. The state defines Islam and has taken upon itself the duty of teaching it to children. Law, for instance, one area of law that was informed by Islamic legal principles more than any others was what's referred to as personal status law. The term personal status law is actually not one that's borrowed from Islamic jurisprudence. But what that means is when you get married and when you get divorced and so on, in the most intimate sphere, when you are acting as a husband and a wife or a son and a daughter, you are legally governed by Islamic law. And states decided to write down, most of them, not all of them, to write down exactly what the approved interpretation of Islamic law is. That is to say, they codified it, they passed it by parliament, and what that had the effect of doing was essentially saying there's all these different interpretations of Islamic law, and the one that you will be governed by is the one that we have decided is best. It goes beyond this. Religious broadcasting is very heavy in many of these societies. You have essentially a private and satellite broadcasting is a relatively recent introduction. So in most of the 20th century, when you turn on the radio, when you turn on the television, you see any religious programming, it is going to be essentially the voice of a state official that you are hearing. The overall effect, then, as what I'm saying was, if you look at it institutionally, was not to Islamicize the state, but you could say to statify. It's not a word, but if it were a word, you could say to statify Islam, to essentially, or you could say nationalize religion. And with the result that it sort of seemed for a while that if you listen to public voices, the voices that could actually make themselves heard in the public realm, if you wanted to hear the voice of the president or the king or the voice of the people or the voice of God, they all were saying the same thing. There were a couple limitations to this, I think. There were a couple ways in which this was problematic. The result was, I should say, incomplete. I'm making it sound as if it was a completely successful attempt, but I think it was limited in two ways. The first way in which it was limited was an analogy, not a particularly artful one, but I think one that communicates it very effectively. When the state decided to swallow up religion, it was a little bit like Saint-Exupéry's elephant being swallowed by the boa constrictor. Okay, it's a little bit difficult for the state to digest all of this, and the shape and the form of the state is very much affected by the attempt to swallow something so large. So what the state essentially did was to fold within itself all these various different approaches, arguments, and so on. And so you have within the I'm going to focus here on Egypt because it's a bureaucratic apparatus that probably studied the best, all these different agencies whose job it is to decide what Islam is. Right? There's a Ministry of Education, which is writing the textbooks. There's a Ministry of Religious Affairs, which is hiring and licensing preachers. There's the Ministry of Communication, which is deciding what to broadcast. There is a state mufti, basically responsible for delivering interpretations of Islamic law to state bodies. There's Al-Azhar, which is the main seat of religious learning, but also delivers interpretations of Islamic law and runs a huge educational apparatus on the side of the official. It runs primary and secondary schools that are on a religious basis. So you have this huge state apparatus developed to talk about Islam. You have a parliament that's legislating. Remember, because of Article 2 that says they should consult Islamic law. You have a court system that says it is sometimes up to us to decide which interpretation of Islamic law should be binding. You have all these various parts of the state apparatus that sometimes have different visions and that are sometimes trying to talk to each other and even contesting with each other about exactly whose interpretation is binding, whose interpretation is valid. For a long time in Egypt, the mufti, the person who's responsible for issuing religious interpretations, was a rival of the Sheikh al-Azhar, the head of the main religious institution in the country. They would sometimes issue dueling fatwas. The problem was solved recently by basically giving the Sheikh al-Azhar some strong authority over appointing the mufti. So that doesn't quite happen so much anymore. But those were the sorts of things that happened. It was a as I say, a little bit hard, even for a highly ambitious and centralized state, to digest. So that was the first problem with the solution that Arab states developed in the 20th century, was that trying to absorb religion sometimes was a little bit more difficult and a little bit less coherent than it had hoped. The second problem with that solution is that it got old. It got old for an awful lot of the societies that were finding ways that, or finding that the official ways in which religion was going to be practiced, expressed, and studied were insufficient, were wrong, were corrupted, and so on. So you have the development. It varies according to the society, but in some places from the 50s and 60s on, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later, of groups and approaches and orientations that are rooted far more in the society than any kind of political or official political structure. The most prominent of these, of course, being the Muslim Brotherhood, but it's hardly the only one. All kinds of movements, some of which have a very strong political face, like the Brotherhood, some of which have virtually no political face at all. Sort of a piety movement of loosely organized people who decide to try to understand kind of religion on their own. You have Salafi movements, which have recently risen to great prominence, that have a sort of a distinctive approach to religion, all new forms of religiosity that are bubbling up at the same time as, for a variety of reasons, the authoritarian Arab states of the 50s and 60s are discovering that they've really overreached themselves, and their grip on the society, they're not becoming more democratic, but they're in institutional terms, but their grip on the society is loosening a little bit. They lose a lot of control over broadcasting, for instance, as satellite broadcasting comes in. They can't stop these signals from crossing borders. They run into fiscal crisis, and therefore literally cannot pay the salaries of all the preachers who are going to be preaching in mosques. Not all the states in the Arab world are suffering from fiscal crisis, but those that are basically found that they were therefore losing control of the religious sector. So this kind of upsurge of popular activism was taking place in a context in which it was certainly not pluralist, but it was one in which the authoritarian grip of the state seemed to be receding. And that's what I mean when I say the control of the state got a little bit old for the people who were living it. That's the situation that I think existed essentially at the beginning of the current century, of Arab states that were had essentially bitten off more than they could chew, if you can remember my boa constrictor analogy, and also ones in which societies were beginning to express religiosity, or people within the societies were beginning to express religiosity in all kinds of different ways. We then come to the events, I think, of the past few years and can understand them and this is the third thing that I wanted to get to, what happens when you try to introduce actual elements of procedural democracy into this context. When what happened essentially in Arab world in 2011 was that once again, people burst into politics demanding not simply populism and popular sovereignty on a rhetorical level, but essentially there were widespread demands for real democratic mechanisms by which the people would no longer speak in the ruler's voice, but in their own voice. And when the people burst in, since a lot of them were religious, a lot of them brought their religious beliefs with them. We're now 3 years into the aftermath of the uprisings of 2011, and I think we've begun to see the deep kinds of practical problems that have arisen as a result of the attempt to combine now democracy with some kind of idea of building a society on a religious basis. What I think the practical experience of the last 3 years have shown is that there are two big problems that arise in the Arab world in a concrete historical context with the effort to institutionalize some kind of democratic procedures in this context. The first problem is essentially that the results are often illiberal, and the second is that the societies are deeply divided. The first problem is the one that usually gets all the attention, but I'm actually convinced it's a less severe problem. The second one gets less attention, but I think is actually more severe. Now, what do I mean by the results are illiberal? Well, let me go back to some things that I was trying to suggest earlier. If you have a religious society which is democratic, what that often means is that when you play politics, a religious card is trump. Okay? And that's what happens when you play democratic politics with a deeply religious society. And the results, as I say, can often be starkly illiberal. It's most obviously the case when it comes to cultural production. We're not going to have any nude movies in this country, okay? Those sorts of things. It's it is one in which, for instance, Islamic personal status law, which I made reference to earlier, is very highly gendered. You bring in a gendered Islamic personal status law with into the system, it is very difficult to make a strong argument, or as I would say, a strong and detailed argument for gender equality. And in fact, when these countries start trying to figure out how they're going to commit themselves to standards of democratic gender equality that are international in nature, such as the Convention on Economic Discrimination Against Women, they find out, well, they can't quite do so. When they ratify the convention, they do so with a reservation for that they won't do anything that isn't consistent with Islamic religion or Sharia law or that sort of thing. There's a matter of religious freedom, again, which I alluded to earlier. The attitude towards religious freedom I've sort of summed up, I think a little bit uncharitably, not entirely inaccurately, by saying the kind of religious freedom provision that this approach gives, a democratic approach, is to say, number one, there is an official religion, it's a religion of the majority, and the state should support and defend it. Okay? So anything that is an offense to Islam needs essentially the state to battle it. It also means that on an individual basis, you're free to believe whatever you want, but when it comes to religious practice, you have to pick one from an approved list. There is no individual freedom of religion here, and in this sense, there cannot be as long as personal status law is primarily religiously based. Right? If you go into a court on a personal status matter, or if you have a personal status dispute, you want to get married, you want to get divorced, inheritance dispute, first question is, what's your religion? And if your answer, that determines what court you go to or what law is applied. And if your answer is, I pick a little bit of this and a little bit of that, or I'm not really sure, or I kind of made up my own, these make zero legal sense. And by the way, what happens if you give that kind of answer is you govern according to Islamic law, because it's the law of default in most of these countries. If you don't choose one, then Islamic law is the law of default. So what I mean by it being illiberal is that it is a conception of the role of religion in public life that is based really more on, I think, communal than individual principles. I'm making it sound perhaps a little bit more alien than it is, because when I think about what this looks like sometimes in practice, it does remind me, I made this argument before, a little bit of the America that my father was born into, right, which banned alcohol, banned commerce on Sundays, prayer in school, and it was not an entirely ecumenical prayer, and so forth and so on. So if you think back to an earlier period, you get some of the flavor. One in which the state, I think, is a friendly force towards religion in general, but also still a little bit of an interpreter and enforcer or defender of religion, and one in which religious rights are primarily exercised, as I say, on a communal rather than individual basis. So democratic majorities, when given a voice, and not just when Islamist movements are in power, but even when non-Islamist movements are in power, tend to adopt what would seem to be illiberal approaches. So that's the first problem. But in a sense, it's not a structural problem. There's my reference to the America that my father was born into suggests that a democracy can certainly survive a host of illiberal practices in the religious realm. That's why I think it's actually the less severe problem. It may be a severe problem if you're it may be an extremely severe problem if you're Baha'i, or if you belong to some sort of heterodox sect, or if you write novels that are considered to be offensive to religion. It would be a problem for those sorts of people, but it's not a problem necessarily for the political system as a whole and for its stability and for its functioning. It may be a problem on normative grounds from a liberal perspective, but it's not necessarily going to be undemocratic or unstable. So then we come to the second problem about this attempt, I think, to combine democracy and kind of religious publics. I talked about 2011 as being the year the people burst in to politics, no longer allowing a single political party or president or some sort of revolutionary leader to speak in their name, but demanding a direct voice themselves. And that sounds wonderful, and that sounds inspiring, and to some extent it's even accurate if you go back to 2011 in specific countries when the societies seem to rise and speak up with a single voice. The problem comes when they keep on talking and discover that they're actually sometimes saying different things. If they have to come up with one word, which they did in Egypt and Tunisia, to some extent in a couple other places as well, in 2011, they could do so. The one word was something like, go. Sometimes it could extend to a short declarative sentence. The people demand the fall of the regime. Okay? It couldn't get much beyond that. And the people in normal political times do not have a single voice. And they have a particularly disparate set of voices when it comes to issues of fundamental values. And the societies, and I think the political systems, were very ill-equipped to handle this. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One is actually historical, and a comparison between the way that democratic mechanisms were brought into the Arab world and the way that they arose in, say, Western Europe. If you take a look at how the institutional and the legal, the juridical steps by which democratic systems were built in Western Europe, they tended to take place in contests over two things. Number one, the franchise, who got to vote. And number two, the powers of the institution they were voting for, the parliament. Okay? So democracy arose sometimes as part of a protracted struggle over the franchise and over whether the parliament would have oversight over whether the cabinet would be politically responsible to the parliament, whether they would have budgetary oversight, whether they could question ministers, and so forth and so on. Those are the institutional questions. And the interesting thing is that those were battled out very, very frankly. There weren't people who were saying, I believe in full democracy, but there were people who were opposed to democracy. There were political movements, powerful political movements that had some of their some questions about these things. In the Arab world, by contrast, universal suffrage was won very easily and without much contest in most places. People want to vote, sure, give them the right to vote. When it's first brought in, there are property restrictions in some countries, and they're done away with. There's some, in a couple countries, struggles about extending the franchise to women. But that's about it. And parliaments, here they've got parliaments. They have parliaments that, if you look at their powers on paper, they sometimes can be actually fairly powerful. They are robbed of that influence sometimes. They were robbed historically by that influence by rigging elections, ensuring that there's, by law, that there's only one political party, ensuring in practice that there's going to be one dominant party, and so forth and so on. So the struggles, the institutional struggle for democracy, in a sense, was won, and won easily and won early in the Arab world, and didn't mean a damn thing. So that the kinds of political struggles, what I'm calling frank political struggles, in which concessions were won, sometimes written down in law, sometimes written down in constitutional form, and by and large honored, had lost all of their credibility, I think, in the Arab world by the time of 2011. People had seen elections before, they'd seen parliaments before, and there was very little confidence that a concession that was run out on paper would actually translate into any new kind of practice. A very strong distrust of democratic mechanisms for that reason. So one of the severe problems was simply that lack of institutional trust. A second problem had to do with another kind of legacy of authoritarianism. It was not simply distrust of formal procedures. It was inability for various political actors to deal with each other. With an authoritarian state that had proved to be such a powerful presence for so long, various political actors were, even when they could articulate their views, would do so directly to the state, or to the regime, or to the rulers. They were not at all accustomed and had no tools, and sometimes very little venue for dealing with each other. Those steps were very rudimentary in most societies. Hammering out a common platform, they could do so sometimes with vague language, but any sort of strong, detailed common platform was very, very difficult to arrive at. And so what they found when, in a sense, some regimes fell so easily in 2011 was that when it came time to go beyond go, or the people want to follow the regime, it was almost as if they were having these dialogues with each other for the first time. And the result, I think, has been that the different visions of the relationship between religion and political authority are ones which people are not used to having with each other. Ones in which they don't trust the language that might be drafted in constitutional legal form to actually be honored by the other side. And so what we have is a period in which, when democracy exists, when democracy is brought in, it is, as I say, first often illiberal, but even more, what it has had the effect of doing is exposing the deep divisions within the society, and without offering any real tools to handle them. Now, constitutional democracy is a political system that's designed essentially precisely to do that, of getting people, people from various political orientations to try and bring their differences to the political process and settle their differences and decide on some kind of policy outcome. So it may be that my kind of negative conclusion is just a little bit premature, that what we're seeing right now is simply the first couple steps in a direction of groups that are politicizing their ideas, bringing them into the political process. The translation of sort of active political life to stable political institutions is one that's very difficult and very time-consuming for all societies. So it may be that the practical problems, which I find so severe in the Arab world right now, are just in reality, the first steps on the road to building some kind of political system in which those differences are successfully managed by the political process. My own fear is that they are steps, in fact, but they're steps in the wrong direction. That what they have done is soured people soured many of these groups essentially in their faith in politics, in their faith in each other, so that the attempt to try and bring religious values into the political realm and to combine that with some kind of formal democratic structure is off to such a bad start that I'm not real optimistic about it turning around anytime soon. So I'm sorry I don't have a happy ending for the lecture, but what I would say, I guess, in lieu of a happy ending, is that the problems, as I've tried to stress, are not about any kind of inability of this religious tradition, of the Islamic religious tradition, to handle difference, to handle politics, to handle even popular sovereignty in the abstract. The problems are real and practical in nature, and they can't be solved simply in the intellectual realm. Thank you. Go ahead first.
Yeah, so I just have a quick question, and maybe I've misunderstood you. So you're saying the problem is kind of some fundamental lack of trust when people are talking about how to combine religion with kind of constitutional regulations. So if it is the case that people don't think that constitutional rules are going to be implemented in the way that they're being written down, what do you think about why people are so hypersensitive to like the very act of changing the Constitution or incorporating these things into constitutional law? Because it seems like to me, protesters realize, and different factions realize that there is power to getting kind of explicit mentions about religion into constitutional regulation, into constitutional law, and they want to they're competing over that. So it seems like they recognize there's power there, and they don't think it's trivial, right? So how do you? Yeah, it seems to me like the problem is less a lack of trust that the law will be implemented, so much as a fear that they're not going to get the laws that they want to be implemented. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, it does. And you may be forcing me to reformulate my claim on the fly, and it's not going to be pretty. I think there's some truth to that, at least for the last few years or so. I mean, this may be just sort of an odd feature of the last few years when there's just been this super concentration on constitutional politics. The way that I would revise my statement, I mean, in a sense, you're right that what people have been trying to do is to get they are worried about the results of the political process, so they want to get their orientation written in as specifically as possible into the Constitution. Yes. The lack of faith is in the political process. The lack of faith is that the political process will be one in which they will have a voice. So it may be less of a problem of faith in constitutional texts than a lack of faith in lack of faith in the political process. And the analogy with 19th century Europe still holds, actually, because a lot of these bargains that I've talked about weren't actually written down in constitutional form. They were ones that were informal ones that were understood by all political actors to be the rules of the game, and only sometimes constitutionalized much later. So that's my way of rescuing my point. Yeah, go ahead.
I had two comments. One was about the comparison with America, and to some degree Europe. And I actually thought that the places where you thought America was similar with these uprisings or new Arab democracies are actually where it's different, and where America was different, it's actually was similar. So those two places are in religion and in politics. So in religion, yeah, I don't know that much, but it may be true that there were school prayers, that there were Sunday closing laws. But those were local institutions that I think were doing those. On the state level, America, Tocqueville comments on this, didn't have an official state religion, which means that the pressures that you're talking about, the fact that the state gets overwhelmed in the earlier phases, and it becomes a liberal, kind of means that religion can fight it out in civil society, perhaps where the stakes are a little less high. So people talk all the time about the paradox of the fact that in America is so religious, right, even though we have a separation between church and state, whereas in Europe, which has a much longer history of state-church relations, they seem to be so secular. But then on the issue of politics, the idea that there's a history of being able to work out problems, I guess you were talking about this more in Europe than in America, but in America, in the early kind of days of the Republic, the Jeffersonians and the Federalists were at each other's throats, with people thinking that Jefferson was going to kind of create a revolution. He was ready to purge the martial court. Political parties were seen as traitorous factions to be purged. And then so that's one comment. And then my second comment is about, I wonder if there might be a problem of using these examples as a way to frame it. So there's been a long history, which other people in this room know much better than I, of a modernization ideology which says things have to go in certain steps. And history, I don't think, tends to repeat itself. And so maybe rather than look at America or Europe, which had certain steps, and generalizing that as a model that's necessary to reach a stable liberal democracy, we should look at places like India or other places that didn't reach its kind of what we call healthy democracy in the same order as America or Europe, which may not be replicable anytime in the future anywhere.
Okay, let me... First part of the first observation is one that I don't have any problem with, but there's an elision that you're making between local government and civil society, right? You're absolutely right. The restrictions were on the state or usually on the local level, but they were real. And they were using the authority of the state. Because America's a federal and decentralized system, state authority presents itself in different forms and at different levels, but it's still fairly intrusive. So that's where I would push back there. On the second part of your first observation, that makes an awful lot of sense to me, and I wouldn't hold up the American analogy that way. The struggle was, in a sense, came in a different form in the United States than it did in 19th century Europe. The second observation is actually one that I agree with. I use the analogy essentially only as a gateway to this argument that you really have to look in concrete historical terms. And in a sense, that's very much in the spirit of your observation. And I do that because I think any time that you talk, especially in a general audience, about, I would say about Islam and the Arab world, there is a willingness to accept a much higher level of generalization than one would accept for a system or a society which one is more familiar with. So I'm using it as a way to say, look, these things have to be grounded, not that there's simply one path. I'm not going to pursue the analogy with India or try to figure out exactly which is the most case quite like the Arab world, but I would wholeheartedly agree that it doesn't make sense to think in terms of a unidirectional model change. Yeah, in the back.
In the last 10 years or so, several Arab states have either implemented or are contemplating some deconcentration of power in what were traditionally highly centralized states. In Iraq, for example, you go so far as recognizing a sovereign subnational entity in the KRG. So I was wondering, how much of that debate is happening within individual states? Is there any kind of a transnational discussion about something like the benefits of subsidiarity within the Arab world today? And then secondly, what about these debates is old and familiar? What's really new of recent development? And where is this going?
I'm going to inject myself a little bit more into this answer. There's not enough of this debate, and it's not going very well. I think it's actually an extremely important issue. And I didn't get into it because I think it's less connected with the realm of religion, but I think that when I was talking about, for instance, the way in which various political actors within the society are not used to having to deal with each other, one of the reasons for that is the very highly centralized nature of these states. So is there some discussion about it? Yes. But is Iraq a model? Just the opposite. How did it happen? Okay, the UN came in and created this no-fly zone. The United States came in and invaded. They gave this to the Kurds. This is an attempt to divide the Arab world. That's how it is understood in most countries. The Iraqi case, a successful attempt. So the Iraqi federalism, but and it's a bizarre kind of federalism. It isn't necessarily working in Iraq, and it's not viewed as a model. In some states, there is some beginning of some discussion about this, but it doesn't tend, from what I can tell, to kind of cross borders. So, I mean, the relevant countries right now might be, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen. Not so much looking at each other. So there would be possibilities for experiments in decentralization that could cross borders, but I'm not aware of any of these discussions crossing it that way. And the idea, I mean, the argument that I would make is that it's important to have, I think, actually to cultivate politics at the local level if you're going to be having a vital political life at the national level. That's not the way the debate is usually made. It's usually made in terms of need to get away from the center by some kind of group that feels, or region that feels discriminated against. So I don't think the debate is going particularly well, and I don't expect most countries to get very far unless they're ones in which kind of the subnational units really have some powerful clout, like in Libya.
Do you know of anyone doing any research on the financing of Islamic terrorist religious groups, like, for example, Boko Haram, or the one in Niger, I think, also maybe Central Africa? I mean, it seems that the financing, the people who are financing these movements seem to have, rather deep pockets, because these movements have gotten, pretty powerful and have a lot of strength to be able to inflict a lot of damage, especially when you're looking at, northern Nigeria. The other thing that I wonder is, what are the sources of financing for these groups, when it seems to me that they are making Islam look worse, actually, by their actions? Yeah. Where is this coming from?
Let me answer your question in a very little sense. Is there anybody who's doing research on this? And my answer is yes, in the Department of Treasury, okay? Department of Treasury. Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a big concern with finance. Is there anybody in the academic community who's doing it? For the most part, no. I mean, there are a few, but very, very small. What's the reason? This is the sort of thing that, number one, it is the sort of thing that would be hard to track. And number two, because the Department of Treasury is looking at it, it's very difficult to ask questions that sound innocent on this. So there certainly are transnational networks which move funds for charitable purposes. How much this maps onto political activity is something, I'm sure it does to some extent, but it's very, very difficult to get any kind of hard and reliable information. So it's, my own sense is it's not a place where academics are going to make a big contribution. Law enforcement officers are extremely interested in this question, but I'm not even sure that they have tools. And there's as much misinformation, I think, unsubstantiated allegation in the public realm as there is reliable information, which makes it almost impossible. If anybody can say anything intelligent about it, it's not me. So, yeah.
Could you say something about the secularizing tendencies, or those that seek to minimize religion, or have he tried to oppose. Some of them are liberal, as in Tunisia. Some of them are not. Syria, Iraq at one time. There was also the Lebanese Civil War. There was a significant movement to overhaul the sectarian system there. Could you comment on those?
Yeah, I mean, you almost have to go country by country, but in most cases, they're fairly weak political forces, right? The Lebanese is an odd example of this, but I'll use it just because it's so apt. There was certainly a movement against sectarianism in Lebanon. It was active in the Lebanese Civil War. It was led by the Progressive Socialist Party, which is usually now referred to as the Druze Party, right? So why the Druze? Because they were a small minority, and so they were getting lost out. So what started out as non-sectarianism became a sectarian cause. We are the sect against sectarianism, is what the Druze essentially became. And it basically evolved into a movement for protecting the Druze. So what happens is, I think it's a political environment that isn't very friendly to those forces. Lebanon, because of its confessional system, if you start arguing non-confessionally, you have no place. Most other countries, it's not quite that same way, but if you start making the argument of a really strong secular argument, you get almost nowhere with, and it has to do with, essentially with, I think, a very broad acceptance that religious values have an important role to play in political and public life. Now, so anybody who calls themselves secularist, I think gets very, very, doesn't get very far. People who downplay or pay lip service to religious values, they can get somewhere, but actually repudiating them or arguing for this for a separation doesn't get you anywhere. There is, I think, an odd trend that now exists on an intellectual level, and I'm not sure it's going to exist on a political level, but to me it's absolutely fascinating, and I may be reading too much into it. And that is a tendency among some that we would normally define as Islamist intellectuals to adopt secular ideas. And what I mean, I remember talking to a young member of the Muslim Brotherhood. This was about 10 years ago, and I was asking him about the understanding of Islamic law. He says, we as a movement have to distinguish between those parts of Islamic law that we think the state should enforce and those that we just accept as teachings for ourselves as a movement. And the first should be very, very few. And I'm listening to this and thinking, okay, you're privatizing religion. I mean, this is a secular argument. That's where you're going. And so I told him that, and he said, yeah, maybe. So what happens when you talk to other members of the Muslim Brotherhood about this? He said, we don't really talk about ideas. We just talk about what we're going to do. And he left the movement. So, but you hear this sometimes among what I would call kind of pious intellectuals who say the big problem of the last 20 years or so has been this political project by Islamist movements. And what it's wound up doing is bringing down the wrath of the state, alienating potential supporters, and concentrating so much on politics that we forgot all the other things that the religion is supposed to be teaching us. And so what we really need to do is to start kind of movements that are really much more about religion than politics. Now, as I say, I hear this from plenty of people I would call kind of pious intellectuals. Whether it will translate into any kind of political tendency or not, I doubt. And certainly my sense is actually if you do have real political democracy emerging, that's the kind of argument that's very, very difficult to make in the public realm. It just doesn't resonate very, very well. So I'm not sure it will get very far, but it's an interesting intellectual trend that I think is actually growing. Yeah, Andrea.
I changed the topic a little. I wanted to get back to your point about the divides, the divides in society. And, I mean, I've definitely heard people say that we have too many divides in the Arab world. Democratization is not going to work because of the number of divides. But I guess I'm a little, I'm skeptical about whether or not polarization is a problem prior to transition, or whether, maybe I'm just trying to get to the more optimistic endpoint instead, but I'm just saying that, it seems that you're right about the small franchise in Europe, right? That you have a smaller group of people within which to regulate dispute, right? But it does expand rapidly, right? It doesn't go continuously. It's like it goes from a small franchise to a large one, I think, rather quickly. But then also in other cases, Latin America and elsewhere, they had the same problem of having a large franchise close to the beginning of democratization. And I guess, it seems like what democracy is for is a system for overcoming divides, and that system is one of turn-taking. So when people tell me we need to be able to compromise in order to get democracy, I think, well, democracy is not something you need if you can compromise. What you need it for is when you can't compromise and you just decide, hey, I'm just going to wait, to fight another day. And that's the norm I worry about. I don't know how you get that norm, the one where instead of overthrowing Morsi, you just wait and have your turn next time at the polls. The sort of the alternation in power. I mean, I'm suspicious of the sort of idea that you need unity, because it seems like most people who've put forth the unity platform have done so in the name of some kind of authoritarian regime. And that the great thing about democracy is that you don't need to have any sort of unity. And certainly in the US, when I talk to people from the other political divide, I experience them as like, crazy idiots or insane, like in this irrational way. I don't assume that we're closer in our political beliefs than two people would be who are, let's say secularists or Islamists in the Middle East.
Yeah.
I guess that's pessimistic, because I'm not sure where you get the norm of alternation, but it's optimistic where, I'm not sure that divides in society are so bad for democracy, or they shouldn't be. They shouldn't theoretically be so bad.
I agree completely, 100%. That's exactly the problem. The problem is, yes, if everybody agrees, then you don't need democracy, right? You can just pick leaders by lot because everybody believes the same thing. So, no, I agree completely. The problem that I was trying to point to, I was deliberately trying not to make a sort of a general argument about sequencing, because I'm not sure those get very far, but I guess I got into it a little bit with my European analogy. That it's, what you don't have is a couple things. Number one, you don't have any kind of agreement about the bounds of politics. What is a political matter and what isn't? So you have deep divisions in this country, yes, and if you're talking about the United States, and there's also whole wide spheres. If you want to ignore politics in this country, you can. You can just be completely oblivious and you're fine. Okay, there's no understanding of what the bounds of politics are, and people can interpret this as in very personally threatening ways. They're coming into my house. They're coming into my family. They're going to attack my church. They're going to attack my mosque. This sort of thing, and really in sort of personal security terms. So that's what. In terms of alternation in power, I think actually that is again a part of the problem, that you don't have any confidence that elections can be fought twice. And one sort of mundane problem is very few Arab countries have ever had elections twice in a row by the same rules, right? So you don't have any stability of rules, and the idea that elections are ways in which those in power manufacture their majorities is very, very powerful and very, very deeply rooted. So I'm not sure if that has quite the same level. There may be comparable cases, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. And that's exactly what has happened. There are other kinds of divisions, I think, that are laid on top of this, a religious division laid on top of kind of sometimes a class division, geographical division, and so on. So my argument was not that the societies are too deeply divided. It's that the people within those divisions have no tools or venues for politicizing those in a form that lends itself to some kind of political process that can make decisions and make reversible decisions. Yeah.
Thanks very much, for a nice talk. I want to more or less get to the real gist of the analysis in this case. So on the one hand, you're saying, when we look into Europe in this case, we see that democratization of the long term and gradual has led to a lot of liberalization. And we don't see that in the Arab world. It seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, the point that you're making in this case, because now we are dealing with a deeply religious society. Yet you can also make the case in this case that you had, at the beginning of democratization in this case in Europe, be it Italy, be it Spain, or so deeply Catholic societies. Yet there also, despite some hiccups there in the history, in this case you see a trend in this case towards liberalization there as well. And I'm trying in this case to make maybe one important part of the picture in this case, and you've spoken a lot and very lucidly about secularization. But one of the differences there seems to be in this case that in Europe, secularization in this case was part of democratization, because democratization in this case was, and secularization together, were fighting the political power that the church actually had at the beginning of this process. And the beginning of this process was, of course, before the French Revolution, when we actually see clerics having real state power. I mean, bishops being princes and all kinds of things, that the Pope himself, ruler of a state. So we do actually have, since medieval times in Europe, a tradition in this case where religious authorities hold state power. That seems to be lacking in this case from Islamic history. To the extent in this case that you could say, in the 20th and increasingly also in the 21st century, the one player of power in those countries is the state. So to actually exert power, or to have power in the state, of course there are some ways as well through the media and through power, but it's just immensely tempting to gain power in this case through the means of the state, which then also leads to religious players in this case, as we see them, for instance, on the side of Muslim fundamentalists, be them on Muslim Brotherhood, but also on the side, in this case, of people like Al-Assad, meaning more traditionalist authorities in this case, that's actually what they're keen at, getting more or less a slice of the state, which is something they never had before. And that actually leads to this different situation in this case, that while we actually see that in Europe, religion was part of the state, and that is a situation that democratization, liberalization, secularization actually tries to combat. We see it on the other hand in this case in Islamic countries the other way around. At the beginning of the 20th century and all through the first half of the 20th century, religious authority are utterly powerless. That's actually how they want to gain power, through getting a slice of the state. And in this case, the process of increasing democratization is just one of the many means that they actually pursue.
It's a fascinating comment. Let me just give you 3 quick reactions. First, you're absolutely right about the European experience, but it's a little bit more varied, I think, in terms of the way in which it led sort of easily to secularism and or any kind of secularism, liberalism, and democracy, right? Because what you're referring to as hiccups in Spain and Italy, that's fascism. I mean, that's more than a hiccup, okay? I mean, there are some cases. Belgium is, of course, the case where you had Christian Democrats in power for a long time within essentially democratic political order, and you don't have the same kind of hiccups. So it certainly is possible. And what you see essentially is what I would argue would be almost a slow, really, the Christian Democrats becoming more liberal and more secular. And the Christian and Christian democracy right now in Western Europe now, after a century of evolution, is basically kind of what we would call family values. It's kind of like generic good things for good kind of conservative sounding things. So that would be my first comment. The second comment is the argument that you're making. The first part of the argument is interesting because I hear it all the time from Islamists who say essentially, all the time, we don't need secularism because we were never ruled by religious authorities. Islam was born reformed automatically. We're automatically all, Lutherans. This kind of argument. The second part of the argument they don't use the part that you're making about the degree to which they want part of the state, and that leads to my third comment. I mean, I think you're essentially right. Is that there are very few political forces who exist right now who are uncomfortable with the idea of significant state power in this realm. The question is who's going to use it and how. But the idea that it should be there, that the state has a role in protecting these kind of fundamental values, that these are not personal values, but these are public values, is one that's very wide. Now, whether that has to change before you get any kind of democracy or not, I don't know. As I say, if I see any nibbling away of it, it's at the extremes, basically from, I would say, people who, especially in countries where there's a strong Islamist movement, people who are saying you've got to get religion out of politics as a reaction against, and also at the other extreme, in essence, religious people who are saying when you get the state so much heavily into religion, it's corrupting, and just let us alone to be Muslims. And you hear this from, as I say, you increasingly hear, at least from intellectuals who you would normally identify as Islamists.
And if I may, you also hear it from part of the Salafi movement.
Yes.
So there's this so-called Madkhali wing, in this case, of the Salafi
Yes.
movement, where they basically say, no, the state is not the vehicle of this case of creating the kind of Islam that we want to have. It is da'wah that creates the kind of Islam that we actually want to have. Meaning, in this case, mission, meaning proselytizing.
Exactly. Yes. So you have, you have sort of kind of a Brotherhood light version of this argument. What I would say, people who earlier would have gravitated to the Brotherhood, but you certainly have Salafis who are making, we can do what we want to do as long as we have a stable political order. A general is just as good as an elected president. They would, that's absolutely fine. To me, one of the interesting contests, I don't want to get too deep into this, one of the interesting contests, I think, over the coming 10 years or so will be a contest within the Salafi movement between those who have been suddenly they think political doors opened up that weren't there before and are rushing in, and those who are reacting very much against this. And I don't know which trend will win out. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Professor Brown. My question kind of goes back to something that Adria was talking about, and I'm hoping maybe we can open up a little space for some optimism here, which is to say that it seemed like there was a moment in Tunisia where all parties kind of walked up to the edge of the cliff and looked over and thought maybe it's better not to try and push each other off. And it seems like there was this moment where they looked and conflict could have broken out, but it didn't. And I was wondering, you're shaking your head, I'm wondering if you disagree with that characterization, but it seems like they sort of got themselves off the path of violence and sort of were able to set down some kind of bargain that seems to be working for them better now than it did a couple of years ago. And so I guess the question is, what did they do right, and what did they do wrong, and what are they still kind of struggling over?
Okay. The first part of my answer is I think my neck must be constructed weird, because I was nodding, I thought. But if nodding is taken as shaking my head, then some kind of anatomical problem. So I was agreeing. Yeah, I didn't talk about Tunisia. I'm anchored very much in Egypt, as may be obvious to some of you. But Tunisia is obviously a contrast, and I think it's exactly as you described. It is not necessarily that Tunisians overcame their differences. In a way, I think my impression, and it is fairly superficial when it comes to Tunisia, is that they became more aware of how much they disliked each other as a result of the last 3 years. And I like to joke, but it's actually true. A couple times I've been to Tunisia and given talks, and I begin to talk by saying, both times I was just coming from Egypt and everything's screwed up there, and you guys are doing so well, and Tunisians would get angry. No, this is awful here. Don't you know what they're doing? And so it's not any kind of grand grand settling of differences. What are the Tunisians doing right? I'm not sure that individual actors are necessarily doing anything right. I would point to two things that happened in Tunisia that are in contrast. Number one, there was nobody who had nobody who had the ability to turn over the table, which there was in Egypt. Okay, and that was the military. And to some extent the security apparatus. They recovered that ability. And as a result, they had to deal with each other. They could not go anywhere else. And the second were the election results. If you were going to do anything through the democratic process, you had to have, if you wanted to get 50% plus one, you had to build a coalition. It was still extremely painful. and extremely threatening. And there, I mean, this was not completely peaceful. There was violence and threat of violence. So it's not necessarily that the Tunisians, on an individual level, did anything right, but they were I think were blessed with slightly more favorable circumstances. And my hunch is, if they could have thrown each other off the cliff, they would have, and could not. They could not throw each other off the cliff, and that was the fundamental reason. And in a sense, therefore, Tunisia is an optimistic outcome precisely because what I think we saw when they finally adopted the Constitution was, in my mind, an agreement to say, let's just start normal politics. We're not going to be able to settle all this in constitutional form. We're not going to be able to write in everything. This gets back to the earlier question about the use of the Constitution. We're not going to be able to settle all political conflicts right here, right now, and write everything down. Let's just start going. And, you know, with people we don't necessarily like that much. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could put the difficulties you're talking about in terms of the religious differences in Egypt, sticking with Egypt, against other factors that are making this difficult. In particular, as you just mentioned, the role of the military and this kind of deep state. Because it seems like your argument about those difficulties could apply even if religion weren't even on the table, more or less. Just looking at any kind of post-authoritarian state. And so I was wondering if you could answer, kind of contextualize that. And then also about the role of the development of political parties maybe in filling this space where a lot of the themes you came back to were about this kind of difficulty of talking in spaces that are more constructive, and that often that is those spaces in kind of normal politics, if you want to stick with that phrase, happens between and within political parties. And I mean, it seems like in Egypt that process never really, despite the proliferation of parties right after the revolution, it never became the venue for, that coalition building didn't incorporate the kind of dialogue you're talking about. I'm wondering why that was the case.
I'm not sure I understand the first question. I mean, but the second I think I understand. But this first having to do with, you said, contextualizing Egypt.
Well, how is your story different from any post-authoritarian state where you have security services that are politicized and are tied to the ruler in a way that's extra constitutional? Egypt has all of those difficulties. Even if they solve the religious the fundamental values issue, wouldn't they still be facing the same sort of problems of distrust?
Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think they absolutely would be. They would be facing the same kind of problems of distrust. I'm not sure how. I mean, there are some distinctive features about about you calling the deep state in Egypt. I think that are a little bit different. They're not unique, but they cut down on the number of comparable cases, and they're essentially the degree to which these institutions had a great degree, in my mind, of institutional autonomy and were able to function on their own. There are other political systems like that, but not all authoritarian regimes are built with, I think, such a very strong sense of institutionalization of some of the key and autonomy for the authoritarian institutions. But would these problems exist without even the deep religious divides? Absolutely. I think it may have been easier to craft a political response to them, kind of with a big failure of the Egyptian revolution, I think, was based on the failure of various political and social actors to craft any kind of program for dealing with it, or any kind of transition, essentially just signing a blank check over the military for running the transition. They signed away responsibility for it. In terms of your second question, then I'm sorry, again, remind me. It was about
Just about political parties.
Political parties, yeah. I think that is actually part of the problem. I mean, I wasn't referring to it by naming political parties, but that was to some extent, in the back of my mind. When I actually interviewed some of the people who were involved in attempts to mediate between Morsi, the Brotherhood presidency, and the opposition. And it was in spring of 2013. European diplomats, American diplomats, domestic political actors. What was interesting to me was it was clear who they were trying to, it was clear who Morsi was. It was clear who kind of the military and security apparatus. It wasn't clear who the opposition was. Who do they speak for? And in essence, I think the Brotherhood made a very conscious decision. Those people aren't worth talking to. They're just a bunch of armchair intellectuals. And it wasn't clear whether if the opposition had come to an agreement, they could have made it stick. So that was part of the problem. In a sense, I think the weakness of that part of politics. How do I explain that? A lot of that has to do, I think, with the legacy of authoritarianism. The political realm was a realm of that was feudal. So the only real political actors, politically viable actors with any kind of organized constituency after 2011 were those who had organized outside of the political realm, like the Brotherhood and the Salafis. That was it. There was a possibility for a trade union movement. It didn't arise. In Tunisia, you had the trade union as a viable political actor, and it made actually a big difference, another player in the game to kind of pluralize the situation. So you had no real organized constituency for them to draw on. And the revolutionary mobilization was so quick and so rapidly successful that they never built any kind of permanent institutional structures that could be, in a sense, proto-parties. So that was what happened. And again, had you had different kind of electoral outcomes, if you'd had the Brotherhood perform weaker and a whole host of divided opposition, but still ones that the Brotherhood had weak, I think you could have had a political space in which those parties would emerge over 5 to 10 years. But they can't emerge overnight, and that's in a sense what would have been required for them to have formed. It's not just coalition building, but it's even deal cutting. They could not even cut deals, much less buildings with each other.
Thank you very much. We can continue the conversation upstairs.